Okay, welcome back. So as we mentioned yesterday, we did a beautiful, wonderful date day and did 3 movies in one day because we're awesome. So we talked about the last film we saw first, so now we're back to cover the previous 2. So we'll start with the first film we saw yesterday, BJ Novak's Vengeance, which I have a hard, whenever I hear that title, it was a wrestling pay-per-view there for a while, so I always think of that.
Small amounts of wrestling in this.
Yeah. So before we get into it, let's talk really quick about
BJ Novak.
Well, not so much. Well, if you want to talk about BJ Novak, go ahead.
Well, BJ Novak, of course, got his, like, what you would consider his start as the writer of The Office. He's gone on to write lots of things. Partnered with people like Mindy Kaling and oh gosh, I'm gonna lose my train of thought now. So we just had brunch and it was delicious. And sorry, I can't make totally complete thoughts.
So that'll make for an interesting set of reviews.
But he is a writer, and he tends to be what you would consider to be more of a hipster kind of writer, kind of cerebral. So I believe this is his first.
I think it is
solo feature-length project.
I think it is. So that's good information to have. So what I was going to say is, before we get into it, is in case you haven't heard of this movie, because this is one of the smaller.
It is a smaller release.
Films. So it's possible you've never heard of this. So in this film, BJ Novak plays the exact kind of character you expect BJ Novak to play.
Right.
I would say he basically plays BJ Novak, but I don't think the actual BJ Novak is the same character that he's always been portrayed as.
It's one of those that you do, it's the exaggerated version.
Yeah.
In the one movie we watched, Always Be My Baby, the Keanu Reeves character is the exaggerated.
Or, Brian is kind of the exaggerated Seth MacFarlane.
Right.
So at any rate, he plays, BJ Novak, essentially. This New York hipster writer. One of these, I don't know what I've heard the term plastic liberal. One of these people who thinks they're so enlightened and thinks they're so in touch with everybody, but when you get right down to it, they're just full of shit.
Yeah.
But they don't know they're full of shit. So, but one of these pretentious kind of, I know what's hurting America and the heartland and all of this nonsense. And he gets a call that a girl he had hooked up with a few times, that she has died, and the family seems to think that he was her long-term boyfriend. So they invite him back to Texas, this little rural town in Texas, for the funeral. The older brother believes she was murdered and wants BJ Novak to help him track down who did it so they can enact vengeance.
Right.
And BJ Novak, the old, playwriting or directing question of what keeps them in the room, wants to stay and use this as the basis for a podcast.
Right, he's trying to find a podcast. He wants to have his voice heard.
Yeah. So, investigating this town and the people and all of this as he's doing this podcast, so that as he's unraveling this maybe murder, maybe not, mystery. So that's the basis for the story. Right.
And I think that there's some great cultural touchstones in this. You're talking about the true crime genre,
which you would know more about than me.
Right. I'm a true crime junkie, and I listen to the podcasts, and I've researched the stories and whatnot, and there is always a question of the ethics regarding that. Are you just using this family and their tragedy for their own purposes, for your own purposes? Is it actually helpful to the case or the victims? There's a lot of ethical questions and conversations that surround that, and this movie does go into that a little bit, I think. But you also have this socioeconomic divide. Do your beliefs and standards actually follow through with how you act as a person? I just think there's a lot of talking points that you could take away from this movie.
What's most interesting to me about this movie, and we talked about it right when we came out of it, is that there, like you say, there are all of these talking points and all of these things, especially, given the very easy to understand starting point. Yuppie from New York visits, the Clampetts.
It's like a Doc Hollywood story.
Yeah, so you get the Hollywood shorthand. But what I thought was interesting about this film is it never came down solidly on one side or the other.
No.
It was a very even-handed and said that BJ Novak's character is right in certain perspectives, but he's also sadly misguided in a lot of perspectives. And that the Texas folk are right in a lot of perspectives, but they're also sadly misinformed on a lot of perspectives. So it's not saying that one is superior or better or right, but it is offering that there are strengths and weaknesses to both standpoints. This is a very intellectual film.
It is, and I think we talked about one of the places where it kind of does suffer a little bit is that in part there are cerebral moments that just get too cerebral.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, we get it, we understand what you're talking about, you don't have to keep explaining it to us.
Yeah.
Particularly where the Ashton Kutcher character comes into play.
Yes.
Which was a pleasant surprise, I think, to both of us.
Yes, very much. I never thought much of Ashton Kutcher as an actor.
I feel like he's pretty one note most of the time. But I don't know. There was something kind of very sincere and genuine about him in this film. And about the whole movie.
Yeah, it's very well cast. I think one of the themes, we were talking about possible themes that link all three movies that we saw yesterday, is auteur directors.
Okay.
These are all directors, and in two cases, Nope, and this one, also writers, where you are getting kind of one person's singular vision.
I could see that.
And this is BJ Novak's singular vision. The closest thing I can relate this to is probably Clerks.
Right.
Where, obviously the subject matter and everything is very different, but in both instances, I feel that the plot, as it is mostly there to serve as a framework for the director and writer and star to kind of get out their thoughts on the world, on society, on themselves, on whatever.
Right.
And which is what directors usually do.
Right.
But it's when you have a writer, director, producer, star all in the same bundle, that's even more so. So this one, you really feel this is him kind of saying, I have all these thoughts, I want to put them down, so here's a story that kind of will help me link all of those together.
Okay. I get that. I would agree with you on that. Especially as you take his very, like I said, very, metaphysical, cerebral thoughts that he starts with at the beginning. His ideas for podcasts, his ideas for writing are more ideas of ideas.
Yeah.
It's thinking about thinking, which gets really pretentious. But then they're more tangible, real life effects as it gets to the end of the movie, I feel like.
Yeah.
I feel like there's just so many little things about this that were, like you said, good shorthands that really did more for describing the character than you would expect.
Yeah, great example. When he goes and meets the girl's family for the first time, he's introduced to the rest of her family, and they all immediately, because again, BJ Novak's character is the point of view character for the audience, they all immediately fit into stereotypes. The one sister is a bigger girl, and the first thing he sees of her is loading up her plate for dinner.
Right.
The other girl is a blonde, has a kind of blonde bimbo, Paris Hilton in The Simple Life kind of thing going, I want to be famous. I want to be a famous celebrity.
Right.
And, they call the son, the youngest son, El Stupido.
Right.
So you automatically, again, very Doc Hollywood kind of things where you're watching this going, okay, we get these archetypes, but they never actually play into any of those archetypes or stereotypes.
Well, I mean, like with the girl, when she's filling up the plate with food, she gives one of the plates to her grandmother. Like,
yes.
You know, she's not even filling it up for herself.
Exactly.
So, like, you know, it's just little things like that. They never want, and as, you know, a big girl, I appreciate they never use her size or her appearance as a plot point at all.
No, at all. Or a character defining trait. It was, this is just who she is. And again, he plays that in very subtle ways. Probably one of my favorite lines in the scene, because this is always one of our favorite jokes, Chekhov's gun.
Yes.
Where B.J. Novak, in very pompous ways, explaining the concept of Anton Chekhov's theory of Chekhov's gun, where if you show the audience a gun in the first act, someone has to get shot by the end of the third act. So he's explaining this to the two daughters in a very pompous way, and they both kind of go, well, but which one of his plays has a gun? There's not one in the cherry orchard. There's not one in Uncle Vanya.
And he goes, well, I haven't actually read any of his
Yeah, I haven't read any of the plays. I just know the theory.
Yeah.
And for my fellow theater nerds out there is one in The Seagull. But now that I'm thinking about it, I'm not sure if it's actually written that it has to be seen on stage.
It's just...
I know that Constantine shoots himself in the head and misses. But now I don't know if the gun is actually on stage. Now that I mention it, but yeah, little things like that subvert both the way he as a character sees them, interacts with them, and the way we as an audience do.
A couple of times the characters call him out on it.
Yes.
It's great.
Yeah.
You know, like, it's just, and they really kind of get him for what he doesn't know.
Yeah.
But back to like the shorthands, the first time you see or even hear BJ Novak, he's talking to John Mayer, and they're talking about all their hookups and all the girls they're with, and it's just such a good, like, if you know anything about pop culture, you know John Mayer is about like this player, never settles down, you know, heartbreaker guy, and just like introducing him as that guy, you don't have to go into a huge backstory or exposition. You know what that guy is. You know he's a player. You know he doesn't want to like settle down or have a serious girlfriend. You have that already in the first couple of minutes because of putting him in that position, and I appreciated that. I
think again, it all comes back to B.J. Novak.
Mm-hmm.
And again, one of the things I think this is a really well written film, not just in terms of the monologues and the dialogue and all that, but just the character beats, the background of the characters, the drug dealer,
right? Oh my gosh,
that
I
he
love
meets,
the story of the drug dealer, which
has one of the most beautiful and unexpected moments, which then plays back to a visual cue we got from the girl's room when he first in it. So there's a lot going on here, and I think I mentioned this. Twist the phone back to the I mentioned this when we were waiting for the second movie to start. Is compare this. It's always interesting when you see actors or acting in their own movies that they've written and directed. Compare this to, say, Ben Affleck, who in the movies he directs, that he acts in, he's always the hero.
Right.
You know, maybe a flawed hero, like, say, The Town,
mm-hmm.
or Color of Night, but still the hero. He's still the guy we're supposed to be rooting for. B.J. Novak seems to know the way he is perceived, and I don't think he's really this way. He never, in any interview I've ever heard, he never strikes me as this pompous or asinine.
I really can't believe Mindy Kaling would be best friends with somebody who was a jerk.
But he seems to be okay with casting himself in the jerky role. He's clearly the protagonist, but that doesn't make him the hero.
Right.
You know, he's okay with himself being called out and himself being
he knows how his character is going to be perceived, and he's okay with that.
Yeah.
And he leans into it, you know. And I think there's something really beautiful about that, about the honesty in that situation.
I agree. And again, just it's clever in so many different ways in terms of the writing, and I love
the way it was set up with where they would intersperse the podcast.
Yeah.
Over,
to use as kind of narration.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that was really clever. Another thing about this movie is just its train of thought is so subtle, and it takes you from kind of a fish out of water comedy to a much more heavy think piece in such a subtle way you don't really realize it's happened.
Right.
Like, you know that he's going to learn a lesson, and we're going to learn something different, and, you know, through an interaction with these people and learning about the girl, he's going to become a better person. You know that kind of, that storyline. But this movie is like, watch the very first episode of a TV show and then watch the very last episode of a TV show and see how far the two things have come. I cannot think of a movie that tonally, emotionally, thematically is so different from the first scene to the last scene.
Right.
If you just watched the very first scene of this with him and John Mayer and then the very last scene, you'd swear you were watching two different movies.
Yeah.
And how you get from that point to that other point.
It's very natural.
Yeah, it's so seamless. It doesn't feel like there is any...
It doesn't feel like it's forcing morality. In a succinct package with like 96 minutes long.
Yes, the shortest movie we saw yesterday.
Yeah.
By a lot.
It's like perfectly sized.
Yeah.
You know?
So we're praising this movie a lot. But anything...
Well, like I said, I think that some of the monologues got a little wordy. I honestly think he did a great job of subverting stereotypes, not going in the directions that you would expect him to go into. I think he did. There was laugh out loud points. The twists that happened, I was genuinely surprised by, which doesn't usually happen with me in a mystery. Like, I generally have it figured out. I loved the people that they had cast were just right. Like I said, there's a monologue that he does in a parking lot, and there's a monologue that Ashton Kutcher does near the end, that both of those could have been timed up.
Yeah, I think my major problem with it is that, and this isn't a major problem, it's still a good movie, but my biggest thing about it is that it is overwritten.
Right.
It's it reminds me, I've said this before too, it reminds me both of Clerks, and it also reminds me of the plays I wrote in college, with a lot less swearing. Where you think at that point you're so smart, you've got everything figured out, so you're writing all these long monologues about life and love and loss, thinking you've seen and felt it all, and then you go back and read those, 10 years later, you're like, oh my god, I was a pretentious little shit. And I do feel that I as we said, I don't think BJ Novak is at the level that he's always kind of portraying himself at, but you can tell there's a bit of pretentiousness in there.
Right.
Because the film does veer into pretension at certain times.
And I do, it does play into the character. It just needed time, though.
Yeah.
He needed
it needed an edit. And I know that's hard to do when you really love a monologue and you think you just got sounding so perfect to go, okay, I got to cut something. So I sympathize with that.
Do you think this is the apex of BJ Novak, or do you think he's going to go on and do
I think he's got more in him. I don't think this is the apex. I think that there is more to come from him. And I think if he can tighten things up a little bit, which again, the movie's already pretty tight, so it's not like there's a lot, but I do think...
And you said, the plot was kind of the side piece to it, but I really do think there was a solid story.
Oh, there was a solid story, but to me, if you're looking at, I'm gonna get pretentious here, sorry, I don't mean to. You look at Aristotle's Poetics and the 6 elements of drama, and how, he says that, story comes first and then everything else after that. I think for this film, Novak would probably put theme first, character second, and then story third. Because the story is there, it is good, but the story is not the most. This is not Knives Out 2. You're not there trying to solve the mystery.
You do try to figure it out, but that's not the...
Yeah, but that's not the point of the story. The point of the story is how the themes and everything affect the character.
But the interesting part of that, too, is that is part of the plot as well. The fact that he's trying to figure out what the story is, and if there is actually a story, is part of the plot, too. So it gets a little bit metaphysical there for me, you know?
But the only other thing I could say, kind of as a mark against this film, as we kind of said, is that this is a film I feel you need to watch multiple times to kind of get everything.
Right.
And that's not a bad thing. The only thing that plays against it a little bit is that there's not a lot of incentive to rewatch other than to dissect it.
Right. Being able to process it and digest it and rewatch it again and kind of figure out, what the story is. Yes.
Yeah, you got to be in a mood.
This is not comfort food.
Yeah, it's like I always say, I think Citizen Kane is probably one of the greatest movies ever made, but I don't come home after a hard day's work and go, what am I going to watch to unwind today? Citizen Kane. So that does play a little against it. But
I don't know that plays against it. It's just
part of the film. It is, Okay, so I think we've talked this one through fairly well. So let's wrap it up. Unless there's anything you want to add before we go to final grades.
Not really. I really liked the music and the editing in this. I loved Issa Rae as I loved Issa Rae as the podcast editor, because you get to continue having that perspective of the consumer versus the actual people involved in the story, and they are real people, and she's over here referring to them as characters.
Yeah.
And you really do get to see that contrast there. I thought was really good.
Well, what was interesting, we're off on another, this is how you know it's a good movie, is that, again, kind of going against convention, he never hid the fact that he was doing a podcast from them.
Right, no.
He told the family and everybody else, I'm doing a podcast.
Right.
So it was, so the thing that in a weaker film would have been the cause for the all is lost moment later in the end, when the family finds out about it, they already knew.
Right.
So again, just tiny little things he did that subvert expectations.
There's also just tiny little moments of sweetness and genuine, his relationship with the younger brother.
Yeah.
And I think there's just all these little, and of course I think my favorite line from any of the plays yesterday, bless your heart, bless your heart, all your hearts can go bless themselves.
Yes, I love that. I think that was brilliant writing.
It really was.
I love that.
It was great.
So if you live in the South or you've been to the South, you know what we're talking about. Okay, so let's wrap it up. So final grade for Vengeance.
I'm leaning to an A+ on this one.
Really?
I am. I really feel like, especially as the first solo project, I really just, there was so much good in it, and the fact that unprompted, even without doing the reviews, we have had multiple conversations about it.
And probably will have others.
Right. And it's a play that makes you think about, it's a movie that makes you think about the movie and the subject matter, but also makes you want to create things.
Yeah. Very true.
Yeah, I got a A+.
All right. I'm gonna go an A-
Ooh.
on it, because of all the things you said, I think it's a great first outing. I think there's films that get you to talk about them or think about them after you've seen them, and more in just wasn't that fight scene really cool, films that actually get you to think about theme and character and plot structure long after you've seen them. I'm always in favor of that.
Right.
Again, I feel like it could have been tightened up a little bit and reined back just a tiny bit, but not so much that it ruined my enjoyment of it. I enjoyed this film. I think it's a good think piece. So yeah, I give this one a pretty high rating, an A- for this one on me.
I forgot about this. The way that he can build the discomfort in you, and I think this is part of coming from writing on something like The Office. Like, you feel this embarrassed cringe, like when he's at the funeral.
Yeah.
Like, oh, like
I mean, what he did at the funeral was straight up Michael Scott.
And you're like, you're laughing at it, but you're also kind of wincing.
Yeah.
You know,
like that is something you could see Michael Scott doing on The Office.
So, like, yeah, I really felt like that was, I mean, it builds real emotion in you.
Yep.
That's for sure. Anyways.
So, all right. So, that's 2 down. Join us here for us, a couple minutes. For you, maybe you need a break. But we'll be back here shortly to talk about the third of our date day at the movies. So, see you in a little bit. Thank you for joining us. And as always, drive safe, and we will see you at the movies.